So my name is Sarah Lundberg, and I'm going to be talking to you about our sampler preservation project at the Arlington Historical Society. First off, this project was made possible by grants from the Arlington Cultural Council and a partnership grant from Freedom's Way Heritage Area. And I have to say this was a completely different sort of project for both organizations. So we really appreciate the support. However, when I was going onto their website to look up their logo, I did notice that one of our samplers is prominently featured on Freedom Way's 2022 partnership grant program. So maybe we paved the way for other kinds of projects like this in the future. So a lot of people have asked how this project came about, and it's a little bit of a personal story. It's kind of got a funny origin, which really shows you kind of how weird I am and how weird my hobbies are, but I talked to Patsy about it. She decided to go ahead and that it was okay for me to share, so here we go. I am a pretty avid knitter, and I've taken my knitting quite a few places, camping. I've knit at bars, I've knit at concerts, I've knit at music festivals, but I was looking for something more mobile and summer friendly, and so I decided to take on cross stitch. But I don't take cross stitch seriously at all, as you can see from the image on the right, kind of like this kind of cheeky, funny juxtaposition kind of cross stitch, especially the kinds that kind of allude to the old New England style of cross stitch, but with kind of these more funny sayings that go with them. So here's a few examples of some ones that I have done. So I got really into it, and I decided to participate in what was called a mystery stitch along. And this is one where you get a different part of the pattern released every week, and you get to kind of work on it and try to figure out and guess what it is. And there are also challenges that you undertake, and you join with a team, and you get points and all this kind of, unusual stuff for cross-stitchers. One of the challenges one day was to bring your WIP, your work in progress, to your work. So I thought, I've got this one in the bag. So I brought my work in progress, which I'm holding here, and I took a photo of myself with another unfinished work in progress from the museum collection. This was currently housed, these were some of the samplers that had been removed from their frames and were being housed in these flat file drawers. And I'm actually going to talk about that sampler here in a little bit. But then I also took a photo of the one on the right, which is a little bit more ornate and is actually finished. And I was really surprised that I got a ton of messages, and I got a lot of DMs from people wanting to know where the museum I worked was located, whether they could come and visit. And I actually was able to connect with two people in particular who were from Massachusetts who are really into historic cross-stitch. And they told me that they make modern patterns from photos of these historic cross-stitches in museum collections. So I'll talk about them a little bit later. Now, first question is why we remove them from the frames. And that's because a lot of frames are backed in materials like the one you see on the left. This is one is backed in just wood, and a lot of times the wood is right up against the cross stitch itself. Sometimes there's something in between, but the thing in between isn't any better. It's a piece of masonite, it's something highly acidic. So removing those materials is a good idea. Sometimes you do something like the treatment on the right, where you just replace the materials with something archival. However, you usually want to have some kind of a spacer in between the work and the glass so that it doesn't press on those stitches, which can cause problems over time, especially when it's hundreds of years in the future. Another part of the project is a personal one for our former museum assistant, Kate Potter, who in the fall of 2019, she took a course that the Historical Society paid for out of our professional development funds on care of textiles. And she found out a good way to stabilize these loose samplers was this kind of process that she's doing here, and I actually have an example. And that is that you take archival museum blue board, what we call blue board for obvious reasons, and then you attach, this is a polyester batting that is needle punched, so there's no glue involved there, so that's all stable materials, and unbleached cotton, and you make this kind of a board. Measures about the size of the sampler, but with an inch around, so that there's a little bit of a border. And then you kind of just loosely whip stitch around, and then you try to make it so that the stitches don't look super great, because you want to kind of go in and out so that you're not causing a lot of stress on the same point at the same time. So A little tedious. She also attaches a nice number to it. A little tedious, but we started the project at the right time because right as the pandemic hit, this made for a good project for Kate to work on while she was, while nobody was coming to work. You can see her actually at work with the 2 volunteer workstations behind her with no volunteers. So we were able to keep working at this through the pandemic. And then we wrote the grants to the organizations, which provided us the money for us to continue the project, as it turned out to be a lot bigger than we thought it would be. And then we have our pattern makers, who I talked about before, Lynette Lepper and Amy Jones. They're both somewhat local, I think hour or 2 drive away. I can't remember where they're from. They were very excited about our collection. They came out and visited, and we looked through everything, kind of decided what pattern they were going to, or what sampler they were going to choose to make a pattern. They also talked to me about how popular these historic patterns are right now, how there's this like niche group of people who go really into, making these historic patterns, collecting the historic patterns. They also have these retreats where they go to historic sites and they all kind of work on the needlework together, which seems a little unusual to me, but something that they're really into, and we might be talking about doing something like that in the future. We decided to select this piece on the left, which is the oldest sampler in our collection. It's from 1765, and it was done by Mary Richardson. And this was a win-win to do because we actually want to make a facsimile of this sampler because it's on display in the assembly room as part of the April 19th exhibition. Mary Richardson's father died on April 19th, 1775. And it's just not a good idea to have something on display perpetually, so we're thinking we can swap it out during the slow season and just note on the label that it's a facsimile. So one of the steps was getting all the floss right and the linen right, the color of the linen, the weight of the gauge of the linen, which is difficult to do because a lot of these have really faded and the linen has kind of turned brown over time. And one of the steps for that is to remove it from its frame. Then we found something very unfortunate with the removal of this object from its frame, and that was that it was not only glued to a piece of either cardboard or masonite, but it was also folded over on the top, which you can kind of see in the top photo there, which folds are very, very bad idea because those can become tears over time. That's kind of puts a lot of stress on the fiber and becomes a tear over time. So we couldn't in good conscience put it back in the frame that it was housed in. So we made an emergency call to our collection committee and we decided to have it professionally conserved. And it's currently at the office of Deirdre Windsor in Dover. And she's going to be removing the backing, doing a wet clean, and reframing it with the conservation framing with the appropriate spacers and all the appropriate materials. And this is not cheap. It's set to cost between $2,300 and $2,700. So we're very thankful that we had the money in our collection fund to be able to do this sort of work. And there's probably more coming because we found some more samplers where this was the case. So don't have your stuff professionally framed because you never know what they're going to do with it unless you trust them. Here are a couple of shots that Amy Jones is working on for the facsimile of the sampler with those matching colors. The lighting is a little unusual. I think she used fluorescent lighting, but yeah, this is a match of the linen and the colors. Here is a detail of a sampler that came into our collection in this condition. This is another one that Lynette and Amy are interested in drafting a pattern off of. Great sampler, but unfortunately, some untrained person tried to do a wet clean, and some of those colors bled into the linen. This also illustrates why we don't want to do this ourselves, why we want to hire a professional conservator if we're going to do anything like this. So stay tuned for this one. Potentially, it may also need to be conserved. Like I mentioned, this is the other one that we found that was glued to the backing board. So it could also be the glue that made that bleeding. And this was made by Sarah Frost around 1792. This is also a very old one. Here's an image of the pattern here. And this is what it looks like compared to the piece, the similar spot on the piece. So they're following the pattern exactly as it is, including any mistakes and any missing stitches. And basically you look at the symbol and that corresponds to a modern DMC color code. So you can go to any Michaels and pick up the floss for it and stitch your own either on the Aida cloth or on linen to be accurate, and the colors will all match. So this kit will be available. We'll either be selling these as a kit or we'll have some kind of an instant download process, but it will be available in the immediate future. I'll talk a little bit about samplers, but I think for the more scholarly information, I think everybody should please see Doris Birmingham's excellent article in our most recent newsletter that should have gone out to members, should be in your hands by the time you see this, went out this week. But a brief history, sampler originally comes from a French term, exemplar, for example, and that was adopted by the British to be called samplers. And they serve both practical purposes of providing a way for a young lady to mark her future household linens, but also an educational tool for literacy, but also a way to show the family's kind of gentility that you could pay enough money to train your daughter to do this kind of a project. Not very many of them would have been made in a home. A few of them would have been made in a home, but many of them would have been made in a private school. And Doris talks a lot about this in her article. And also the full version is linked on our website for those who might not have gotten their newsletter or might not be members. So these private schools were called dame schools. Usually they were a younger unmarried woman, a lot of times older widow, but the kind of school for the families, the high-class families in West Cambridge at the time seemed to have been the school of a person named Mrs. Gill. She's a person that needs to be further researched. We couldn't find any information on her as to what her first name is or where her school was, but we've seen her repeatedly, and here's one example. This is a finding aid from the Winterthur Library in Delaware. They have a large Whittemore family collection, and it shows that they have a record of a copybook from Henry Whittemore, and that he learned literature, drawings, and calligraphy from Mrs. Gill's Academy. Unfortunately, this material has not been digitized, which is why we have a photo of a finding aid from the web. Hopefully, at some point, if one of our members ever go to that area and want to take photos for us, or hopefully if Winterthur can get this material digitized, we'll be able to see what kinds of architectural drawings Henry Whittemore was drawing. But we also see a lot of mentions of needlework being done at Mrs. Gill's Academy. So it was co-educational, both boys and girls at the same time. Another dame school was one of Pamelia Brown. And here's an example from our collection. It's an image of a certificate to Francis Prentice for excellence in needlework. So we'll have to find a lot of more information about Pamelia Brown. Now I'm going to speak about a few familial connections, but again, I want to draw you to the article from the newsletter, this little kind of side article where they talk about three samplers in the collection, one from a mother, Leticia Whittemore, and two from her daughter, Caroline. Kind of an interesting carrying on of this tradition. Note that Leticia is also the sister of the Henry who has the copybook at the Winterthur collection. It is possible that this sampler was also made at Mrs. Gill's school if the siblings went to the school together. And it also may have been Leticia who cross-stitched these initials in her future husband's linen shirt, and that's HHF for Horatio Hancock Fisk, which is the person that Leticia married. Same Henry from before married Eliza Ann Cutter, and we actually have this sampler that she made on the left. She may have made this in Mrs. Gill's school or elsewhere. It's got a lot of the similar kinds of stylistic details, but I also can't help but wonder if this is a stylized version of her house where she grew up, which is the Ephraim Cutter house that still stands at 4 Water Street. Hard to say. It doesn't quite look like it, but and a lot of the houses kind of look very similar. Another favorite is that one from before. And when we did a little bit of research on this, we found that it tells a more interesting story. At first, the poem kind of seemed like a little bit of a grim story for such a young girl. Talks about flowers decaying and youth and beauty wearing away, and essentially a lot of death and dying. But its maker is Martha M.W. Locke, And the MW stands for her mother, Mary Williams, who had actually just died a few years before while Martha was a young child. So this is probably some kind of a mourning piece for her mother. You can see some of these other details on it. We've got the house flanked by the trees, which you're seeing over and over again, but then you also see two young girls carrying flowers wearing these white dresses. And some of those features are reproduced on this other kind of mixed media piece on the right, which we have a few of those in the collection. They're not samplers, so we didn't cover them as part of this project, but they're a combination of embroidery and painted paper and sometimes other materials, and they're another kind of area of potential future research. You can see that same kind of neoclassical dress and the urn and the tree. It could also just be that that's a popular verse. The same exact verse is actually found in this sampler from the Smithsonian Museum, and coincidentally, not coincidentally maybe, this was made by a person named Suki Foster who lived in West Cambridge when she stitched it at the time. And you can also see, again, another federal house, more trees. So there were definitely some styles going on here. And then another connection is that Martha lived to be an older woman. She lived to 1888. She is shown in Susannah Adams' Silhouette album. And then when she was in her 20s, we actually have a record of her schooling pauper children. This is part of our Overseers of the Poor records. So she may have used some of the skills that she learned at her Dane school to become a teacher herself before she married James Russell. And then she was also in Susanna Nguyen's circle in 1875 when she cut this silhouette for her album. We have two samplers made by Jason Russell descendants. Both of them are great-granddaughters of Jason. Abigail Prescott Russell on the left, who was a descendant through the youngest son Noah, and Sarah Ann Russell on the right, who was a descendant through the oldest son Jason. We have many, many samplers from the Nguyen family, and that illustrates the importance of this craft for this particular family. The oldest is that one on the left. That's the one from the Freedom's Way. It's now shown on the Freedom's Way website, and it's from 1789, and it was done by Susannah Adams. Susannah was born in 1778, and she actually grew up in the old Adams house, which is shown in the middle portion of the slide here, and what is actually the oldest daguerreotype in our collection. And we're so lucky to have so many things from this family and this person in particular. We also have her wedding dress from 1804. It's a little hard to see, but there's a detail shot in the upper center that shows kind of a leaf pattern. She supposedly hand embroidered her dress. This is also that kind of gauzy neoclassical style that you saw on the previous examples of the early 1800s. This style that kind of goes back to the empire style waist, which refers to a lot of them they were trying to look like kind of like Greco-Roman vases, like for this really short period of time. The dresses just kind of changed in that way. And then on the right, we have her as an older woman. I've shown this one quite a few times before because it's a favorite. This is one of those kind of 3-generation photos, which you still see today. And Susannah is on the left. And then in the middle is somebody who might be familiar to some of you, and that is Sarah Georgiana Nguyen. She is Aunt Georgiana to our Nina Nguyen diary readers, or Nina Nguyen diary readers. And then her mother is on the side there. Oh, sorry about that. Got ahead of myself. Here's another photo of Georgiana. She doesn't go by Sarah because that's the same name as her mother. And this is a lot of kind of supposition, but she always kind of has this look on her face in all of the photos. It doesn't really seem that she likes to be all dressed up with her ringlets. She kind of seems a little bit resentful of that. She kind of comes across as somebody who maybe was, I don't know if this is the appropriate term anymore, but like the tomboy. So where all the rest of the Nguyen family was doing the stitching. One of the things that we have from Georgiana in our collection that she made was she made the frames of the paintings that her sister made. So we have a painting that her sister made, and then Georgiana made the frame. So I think it's kind of funny to show her sampler, which she obviously did not have the patience to finish. Also interesting to note that they've kind of come up with an innovation of these faint blue lines to help her find her way on the grid pattern of the linen. And this is also a little late for samplers. Samplers would have kind of been more early 1800s, and we're dealing with the mid-1800s here, but something the family still like to do. This is also another one that comes from the Nguyen family, and these are called perforated paper, and you can use them the same as you would the linen. This is something that was introduced in the 1840s, but it's most popular 1860 through 1900. We're not sure which member of the Nguyen family made these, but if I could guess, I would guess that it was Susannah Adams Nguyen, our artist, our Arlington artist, sister of Sarah Georgiana, and 10 years younger. Complete speculation, but we have a lot of drawings from her as a young child, and there are a lot of telling examples, kind of show some similar kind of ideas throughout. So there's just a few. And then we have another favorite done by Hannah Hall, who later married Cyrus Cutter. It's also got that federal house. And this one is from 1806, and it has a lot of those similar features with the house flanked by trees and all the other motifs going on around the edge. But it also features a fair amount of details, including 15-pane windows on the sides. So she was obviously quite good at this, and this may have been skills that she learned and later translated to another collection object, which is this 1812, another Empire dress, neoclassical dress that she wore at age 16 to a Jubilee Peace Ball at the celebration of the end of the War of 1812. Hand embroidered, handmade by her, as you can see. And then there's a little bit more to the history of this particular dress, if I can go off on a tangent. She also shows up in Susannah Adams Nguyen's Silhouette album as a much older woman. And then Susannah Adams Nguyen wrote a poem called The Ballad of the War of 1812, a little over 100 years later. And the Historical Society had a costume pageant to reflect on the War of 1812. And the dress was worn by our own museum benefactor, Elizabeth Abbott Smith. So there she is on the right, wearing this dress. We won't blame her for the stains. Oh, and also Nina Nguyen wrote about the event. Nina Nguyen wrote about the event in her diary. Last example I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a lone example because we have no other collections for this particular person, but it's an 1818 date and it was made in West Cambridge. And the surprising thing about this is that it was purchased somewhat recently. It was purchased in 2015 on eBay, of all places. And it was purchased and donated by our former president, Robert Frideau, who we unfortunately lost to cancer in September of 2021. This sampler was made by Mary S.W. Brooks. S.W. probably similar to our Martha, stands for her mother's name, but we haven't been able to research it to find out. Has some of those similar flower and vase motifs. What's unusual about this one is it's turned to its side, whereas usually they would be the long way up. They would be vertical rather than horizontal. And we're very thankful to Robert and any other donors who have helped us to fill out our collection of samplers and to also care for these important objects and interpret them for the public. Thank you.